An update now to a story we told you about last week. The BC College of Social Work suspended a social worker in Watson Lake, Yukon, over her belief in conspiracy theories. That prompted the Yukon government to acknowledge its lack of legislation for social workers, and it promised to create new rules. The Association for Social Workers in Northern Canada says it's a step in the right direction. Cheryl Kawaja reports.
Yukon's complete lack of regulatory oversight is well known to social workers who practice here. A commitment to change that is being well received by many.
I am generally a pretty hopeful guy, and I know that it's a long and complicated process, and I mean that doesn't diminish any of my drive to try to help contribute to this, and many of my colleagues feel the same way.
In Watson Lake, the Liard Aboriginal Women's Circle is pleased with news that the Yukon plans to step in line with the rest of the country. However, there are still concerns. As we heard last week, the group also wants Ottawa to take some responsibility. Indigenous Services Canada sometimes foots the bill for counsellors who are working for non-insured health benefits.
This profession should be monitored, and certainly the federal government, I think, has to answer some questions about how they monitor their counsellors. And if it's happened here, I wonder if it's happening elsewhere in Canada. What other services are being paid without any kind of oversight committee? I think that's what has to be looked into.
In an email to CBC, Indigenous Services Canada says the status of any provider receiving funds from non-insured health benefits is reviewed quarterly by checking with the regulatory bodies. So in this case, the social worker in question would no longer qualify for that funding. That's because she has been suspended by the BC College of Social Workers. But Ottawa points back at the Yukon and says that's where the responsibility to regulate lies. Indigenous Services Canada says, "We invite anyone who has concerns regarding the competence of a health provider to file a complaint with the relevant provincial territorial regulatory body." But again, the Yukon doesn't have a regulatory body, and it will take time before that legislation is created. The Association for Social Workers in Northern Canada says it's complicated.
It requires buy-in from community members, from NGOs, from government, and it requires legislation. And I mean, it requires building partnerships with our First Nations here in the Yukon and again across the territories.
And add to that, the government that is promising to bring in legislative oversight for social workers now has less than a year before it goes back to the polls. So when, if ever, this oversight for social workers might happen is anybody's guess. Cheryl Kawaja, CBC News, Whitehorse.